Welcome to GeoHistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. The Russian Revolution. From Tsar to Soviet Superpower. In the year 1917, an empire that had ruled for 300 years collapsed in a single week. By 1945, the same land had become one of the two most powerful nations on Earth. By 1991, it had vanished again, dissolved without a single shot. And in 2026, right now, this very summer, the same ground is once more the center of the largest war Europe has seen since that empire last fell. One land, 100 years, 4 different worlds, each certain it would last forever, each proven wrong. This is the story of how a Tsar became a Soviet superpower, how that superpower turned to dust, and how the same ambitions rose again in a new form, all the way to the war being fought today. It is a story about power, and by the end, one truth will stand clear above all others. Power is never as solid as it appears. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was a giant standing on weak legs. On the surface, it was magnificent. Palaces of gold and marble lined the rivers of St. Petersburg. The aristocracy danced through winters of endless luxury. The Tsar, Nicholas II, ruled as an autocrat, a man whose word was law across a sixth of the planet's land. But beneath the surface, the ground was already shifting. For most of the empire's people, life had barely changed in centuries. More than 80% were peasants. Many still lived in conditions that resembled the Middle Ages, tied to the land, poor, and largely without hope. In the cities, factories had begun to rise, and with them came a new class of workers, crowded into filthy quarters, working long hours for almost nothing. The wealth of the empire flowed upward, always upward, into the hands of the few. The machine of the state was old, rigid, and slow, and the man at its center was not built to lead it. Nicholas was gentle, devoted to his family, and deeply religious. But he was not a ruler for a changing age. He distrusted reform. He believed that any concession to his people was a betrayal of his sacred duty. He wished more than anything for the world to remain exactly as it had always been. The world had no intention of obeying him. The first crack appeared in 1904, when Russia went to war with Japan. It was meant to be a quick and glorious victory over a smaller, distant nation. Instead, it became a humiliation. The Russian fleet sailed halfway around the globe, only to be destroyed in a single battle. The army lost on land. The empire that imagined itself a great power had been defeated by a country most of its citizens could not find on a map. Defeat abroad lit a fire at home. In January of 1905, thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They carried religious icons and portraits of the Tsar. They came not as rebels, but as loyal subjects, hoping to hand their ruler a petition asking for better lives. They believed he would listen. They believed he cared. The soldiers opened fire. Hundreds fell in the snow. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and something broke that day that could never be repaired. The people had looked to their Tsar as a father. Now the father had shot his children in the street. Strikes spread across the empire. Peasants burned the estates of their landlords. Sailors mutinied. For a moment, it seemed the whole structure might collapse. Nicholas, cornered, agreed to reforms he did not believe in. He allowed an elected assembly, the Duma, and promised his people basic rights. The empire survived. The storm passed, but the promises were hollow. The Tsar stripped the Duma of real power almost as soon as he had granted it. The reforms were undone quietly, one by one. Order returned, but trust did not. The wound was covered, not healed. For a few years, the empire steadied itself. Industry grew. Railways stretched across the wilderness. Some believed Russia was finally becoming a modern nation. Yet something had already begun to change. The old faith in the throne was gone, and it would not return. The people had learned that their ruler could bleed them without mercy. That lesson would wait, patient and quiet, for the moment it was needed again. That moment came in 1914. When the great powers of Europe marched into the First World War, they expected it to end by Christmas. It did not. It became the largest and most devastating conflict the world had ever seen, and Russia threw itself into the very center of it. The empire mobilized millions of men. On paper, it was the largest army on earth. In reality, it was a tragedy waiting to happen. Russian soldiers marched to the front without enough rifles. Some were told to pick up the weapons of the dead. They lacked boots, food, and ammunition. Their commanders were often incompetent, their supply lines broken. Against the disciplined German war machine, they were slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands. By the second year of the war, the losses were almost beyond counting. Millions were dead, wounded, or captured. The countryside emptied of its young men, the cities emptied of bread. And then Nicholas made the decision that would end his dynasty. He left the capital and took personal command of the army at the front. It was meant to inspire his soldiers. Instead, it tied his name directly to every defeat that followed, and it left the government in the hands of his wife, the Empress Alexandra, who was deeply unpopular, and worse, under the influence of a strange and mysterious figure. His name was Grigory Rasputin. He was a wandering holy man, filthy and wild-eyed, who claimed the power to heal, and he alone seemed able to ease the suffering of the royal couple's sick young son. Alexandra trusted him completely. Through her, he came to influence the affairs of the state itself. To the Russian people, it looked like madness. The empire was dying on the battlefield while a peasant mystic whispered in the ear of the throne. Rumors spread. Faith in the monarchy, already weakened, collapsed entirely. By the winter of 1917, the capital was starving. Long lines formed outside empty bakeries. The cold was merciless, and the anger, which had been building for years, finally found its voice. It began with women, workers marching for bread. Then more joined. Then the factories emptied. Then when the soldiers were ordered to fire on the crowds, they refused. They turned their rifles around and joined the people instead. Within days, the imperial government simply ceased to exist. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand. The empire of 11 time zones fell apart almost overnight, dissolved by exhaustion and hunger. Nicholas II, far away and cut off, was advised by his own generals to step down. On a quiet day in March, he signed away the crown that his family had held for 300 years. The Romanov dynasty was over. He signed it calmly, almost with relief, and with a few strokes of a pen, the largest empire on earth was left without a ruler. Into that emptiness, everything now rushed. Power abhors a vacuum, and Russia in 1917 was one of the largest vacuums in history. A new government took shape almost immediately. It was called the Provisional Government, made up of moderate politicians who believed in democracy, reform, and law. They promised elections, they promised freedom. They spoke of a bright new Russia, a nation of citizens rather than subjects. But they made one fatal decision. They chose to keep fighting the war. The people wanted three things above all else: bread, land, and peace. The new government could deliver none of them. The soldiers were still dying at the front. The peasants were still waiting for land. The cities were still starving. And so the vacuum remained unfilled, waiting for someone bold enough to seize it. That someone had just returned from exile. His name was Vladimir Lenin. For years he had lived abroad, a professional revolutionary, writing and plotting the overthrow of everything Russia had ever been. He led a small, disciplined, and utterly determined faction called the Bolsheviks. Where others compromised, Lenin did not. Where others hesitated, he acted. His message was simple, and it cut through the confusion like a blade. Peace, land, bread, all power to the workers' councils. End the war at once. Take the estates of the rich and give them to the poor. It was exactly what millions wanted to hear. Through the summer and autumn of 1917, the Bolsheviks grew. They organized. They infiltrated the army and the factories. They waited for the provisional government to weaken. And it did, growing more helpless with each passing week. Then in October, they struck. The Bolsheviks' seizure of power was almost anticlimactic. There was no great uprising of millions in the streets. A relatively small, organized force took control of key buildings, bridges, and communication centers in the capital. They stormed the Winter Palace where the provisional government sat helpless and arrested its ministers. It was over in a night. A small group of determined men had captured a sixth of the world. But capturing power and holding it are two very different things. Almost immediately, the country descended into a brutal civil war. On one side stood the Bolsheviks, now called the Reds. On the other stood a loose coalition of their enemies, the Whites, made up of monarchists, moderates, and foreign-backed armies who wanted the revolution crushed. Even other nations sent troops to help destroy the new regime. For nearly 3 years, Russia tore itself apart. The land that had already lost millions in the World War now lost millions more. Famine swept the country. Disease followed famine. Entire regions descended into chaos, terror, and starvation. It was during this war that the old imperial family met its end. Nicholas, his wife, and their children were held prisoner in a distant town. One night they were taken to a basement and executed, all of them, so that no heir could ever return to rally the enemies of the revolution. The dynasty was not only removed from power, it was erased. The Reds won. They were more organized, more ruthless, and more unified than their divided enemies. But they inherited a broken country. The economy had collapsed. Millions were dead. The great cities stood half empty. The revolution had triumphed, and it had triumphed over a wasteland. From that wasteland, a new kind of state would be built. In 1922, it was given a name that would echo across the century: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union was born, but the man who had built it did not have long to enjoy it. Lenin's health failed quickly. A series of strokes left him weakened, and by 1924, he was dead. He had created a state, but he had not clearly named who should lead it after him. And so, once again, a vacuum opened at the top of Russian power. This time, the man who filled it was one few had expected. His name was Joseph Stalin. He was not a brilliant speaker like Lenin, nor a famous theorist. He was quiet, patient, and endlessly calculating. While others fought for the spotlight, he built control over the party's inner machinery, appointing loyal men to key positions, gathering the levers of power into his own hands piece by piece. By the late 1920s, he had outmaneuvered every rival. His opponents were pushed out, silenced, exiled, and eventually destroyed. One by one, they fell, and Stalin stood alone at the summit of a nation of over 100 million people. What he did with that power would reshape Russia forever, and cost more lives than the war and the revolution combined. Stalin believed the Soviet Union was decades behind the West, and that it would be crushed unless it caught up fast. So he launched a transformation of almost unimaginable scale. He would drag a nation of peasants into the industrial age in a single generation, no matter the human cost. The plan came in waves. First came the collectivization of agriculture. The land that peasants had been given during the revolution was now taken back and merged into massive state-controlled farms. Those who resisted, especially the more prosperous peasants, were branded enemies and destroyed. Millions were deported, imprisoned, or killed. The result was catastrophe. Grain was seized to feed the cities and to sell abroad, even as the countryside starved. A terrible famine swept across the land, striking Ukraine with special severity. Millions died of hunger in one of the most fertile regions on earth. It was a famine not of nature, but of policy. At the same time, factories rose across the country at a furious pace. Entire cities were built from nothing. Steel mills, power plants, and railways spread across the wilderness. In barely a decade, the Soviet Union transformed from a backward agricultural nation into a major industrial power. The scale of it was staggering, and it was real. But it was built on fear. To hold his grip on the nation, Stalin unleashed a wave of terror unlike anything before it. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be arrested in the night. Old revolutionaries, army officers, engineers, writers, ordinary citizens, no one was safe. Confessions were forced, trials were staged, countless people were executed, and countless more were sent to a vast network of prison camps that stretched across the frozen north and east. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Fear entered every home. To speak the wrong word or to be named by the wrong person could mean death. The revolution that had promised freedom had built one of the most controlled societies in human history, and yet by any measure of raw power, it worked. The Soviet Union grew stronger, more industrial, more unified under one iron will. On the surface, it appeared unstoppable. However, a far greater test was coming, and it would arrive from the West. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest land invasion in the history of the world. Millions of German soldiers poured across the Soviet border, backed by tanks, aircraft, and a doctrine of total conquest and extermination. Their goal was not merely to defeat the Soviet Union. It was to destroy it entirely. The early months were a disaster for the Soviets. The German army advanced with terrifying speed, capturing vast territories and taking millions of prisoners. Whole armies were surrounded and destroyed. The enemy reached the outskirts of the great cities. It seemed for a time that the entire nation might fall, but it did not fall. What followed was a struggle of almost incomprehensible scale and suffering. The Soviet people fought with a determination born of desperation. Factories were dismantled and moved thousands of miles east, out of the enemy's reach, and rebuilt to produce weapons around the clock. Millions of soldiers were thrown into the fight. The land itself, vast and brutal, swallowed the invaders. The winter, merciless as always, turned against them. The turning point came at a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. There, in the ruins of a shattered city, the two armies fought street by street, building by building, for months. It became one of the bloodiest battles in all of human history. When it ended, an entire German army had been destroyed. The tide had turned. From that point on, the Soviet army pushed westward, grinding forward through unimaginable losses, driving the enemy back across the lands it had conquered. City by city, country by country, the Red Army advanced until it reached the enemy's own capital. In 1945, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of Berlin. The Nazi war machine was destroyed. The most terrible war in history was over. The victory was total, but the cost was beyond measure. The Soviet Union had lost more than 25 million people. No other nation in the war suffered anything close. Entire cities lay in ruins. Vast regions were burned to the ground. An entire generation had been consumed. And yet out of that ocean of blood and rubble, the Soviet Union emerged not weaker, but stronger than ever before. It had defeated the most powerful army in the world. Its soldiers now occupied half of Europe. It was no longer merely a nation. It had become a superpower. The empire that had collapsed in hunger and shame 3 decades earlier now stood as one of the two most powerful forces on Earth. The world that emerged from the war was divided in two. On one side stood the United States and the democracies of the West. On the other stood the Soviet Union and the nations it now controlled across Eastern Europe. Between them lay a divide so deep it became known as the Iron Curtain, a line splitting the continent and much of the world into two hostile camps. There was no open war between them. Both sides possessed weapons too terrible to use. For after the war, both raced to build atomic bombs and then weapons far more destructive still. A direct clash could mean the end of civilization itself. And so the conflict took another form, a long, tense standoff that would last for decades. It became known as the Cold War. For a time, the Soviet Union seemed to be winning it. After Stalin's death in 1953, the terror eased, though the system he built remained. The Soviet Union poured its resources into proving that its way of life was superior. And in one arena above all, it stunned the world. In 1957, it launched the first artificial satellite into orbit, a small metal sphere circling the Earth, sending out a simple signal that the whole world could hear. It was called Sputnik, and it shocked the West to its core. The nation of starving peasants had reached space first. Then, in 1961, it sent the first human being into orbit around the Earth. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and for a brief moment, the entire Soviet experiment seemed vindicated. The country that had risen from war and famine now led humanity into the stars. Its influence spread across the globe. Revolutions in distant lands looked to Moscow for support. Its ideology inspired movements on every continent. Its military might was immense, its rockets and armies the equal of any on Earth. For a few decades in the middle of the century, the Soviet Union stood at the very peak of its power, a rival to the mightiest nation in the world. a beacon to millions who dreamed of a different kind of future. It had come so far from a collapsed monarchy to a spacefaring superpower in less than half a century. But this would not last. Beneath the triumphs, the foundation was quietly rotting. The Soviet system was powerful, but it was also rigid, wasteful, and deeply inefficient. Its economy was controlled entirely from the top, planned by officials who decided how much of everything should be made. It could build rockets and armies. It could not reliably fill the shelves of its own stores. While the West grew richer and more comfortable, the Soviet citizen waited in long lines for basic goods. Shortages became a way of life. The quality of ordinary products was poor. The gap between the promises of the revolution and the reality of daily life grew wider with each passing year. The arms race with the West consumed enormous resources. Vast sums were spent on weapons and military might, while the ordinary economy fell further behind. The Soviet Union was spending itself into exhaustion to keep pace with a rival that was simply richer. And the system itself had grown old and tired. The leadership aged. The bold revolutionaries were long gone, replaced by cautious bureaucrats who protected their privileges and feared any change. Corruption spread through every level. The great ideals had faded into empty slogans that few still believed. The people saw the gap between what they were told and what they lived, and they stopped believing. By the 1980s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Into this decline stepped a new leader, younger than those before him, who understood that the system could not continue as it was. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He believed the Soviet Union could be saved, if only it could be reformed. So he loosened the controls. He allowed greater openness, permitting people to speak and criticize as they never had before. He tried to reshape the failing economy. His intentions were to heal the system. Instead, he exposed how sick it truly was. Once people were allowed to speak freely, decades of buried anger came pouring out. The nations trapped within the Soviet Union began to demand their freedom. The countries of Eastern Europe, held for so long behind the Iron Curtain, began to break away one by one. In 1989, the wall dividing Berlin, the great symbol of the divided world, was torn down by ordinary people with their own hands. The empire began to unravel from the edges inward, and it happened faster than anyone imagined. One by one, the republics that made up the Soviet Union declared their independence. The center could no longer hold them. The economy was collapsing. The old guard tried to seize power back in a desperate final attempt, but it failed within days, and its failure only accelerated the end. In December of 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally dissolved. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The superpower that had defeated Nazi Germany reached space first and stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest nation on Earth, simply ceased to exist. There was no invasion, no great war, no final battle. It ended much as the empire before it had ended, quietly from within, exhausted by its own contradictions. In the span of a single century, Russia had transformed from a monarchy into a revolution, from a revolution into a superpower, and from a superpower into 15 separate nations. And the wheel had come full circle. The years that followed the collapse were harsh. The new Russia plunged into chaos and poverty. The certainties of the old system were gone, and what replaced them was confusion, corruption, and hardship. Savings vanished overnight. A handful of men seized control of the nation's vast wealth and became immensely rich, while ordinary people struggled to survive. A great power had fallen, and its people paid the price and lost security and lost pride. Out of that turmoil, a new leader rose at the very end of the century. His name was Vladimir Putin, a former intelligence officer, quiet and controlled, who promised to restore order and to restore Russia's greatness. Under his rule, the state reasserted itself. Wealth flowed back toward the center. Opposition was silenced. Elections were held, but their outcome was never truly in doubt. Constitutional limits were rewritten, clearing the way for him to hold power, in principle, into the 2030s. The methods of control returned in new forms. The old instinct for centralized power reasserted itself. The names had changed, but the deeper patterns had not. And Russia looked outward again, toward the lands that had once belonged to its empire. In 2014, it seized the peninsula of Crimea from Ukraine. Then, in February of 2022, it launched a full invasion of Ukraine itself, expecting a swift victory, expecting the capital to fall within days. It did not fall. Instead, the war became something Russia had not planned for. Long, grinding, and enormously costly. What was meant to last weeks has, by this summer of 2026, dragged on for more than 4 years. Russia now controls roughly a fifth of Ukraine, but it has paid for that ground in a currency measured in the hundreds of thousands. By the middle of 2026, estimates of Russian military casualties, killed and wounded, climb well past 1 million. Ukraine's losses, though smaller, run into the hundreds of thousands as well. Tens of thousands of civilians are dead. Millions have fled their homes. The scale of the destruction recalls the great wars of the century that came before it. And still it continues. The war has reached deep into Russia itself. Ukrainian drones now strike far behind the front, hitting oil refineries and export terminals, at times knocking out a fifth or more of Russia's capacity to process its own oil, the very resource on which its power has long rested. The economy that once seemed to shrug off the pressure of sanctions has slowed almost to a standstill, its growth for this year forecast at barely more than zero, its reserves steadily draining away. Peace talks have come and gone. Delegations have met in distant cities. Proposals have been drafted and set aside. But as of this summer, no lasting agreement has been reached, and the killing has not stopped. The maps of tomorrow are still being drawn in blood and uncertainty, exactly as they were 100 years ago. The present remains unsettled, its ending still unwritten. But the deeper story is older than any single leader or war. So the wheel has turned once more. In 1917, a Tsar signed away a throne his family had held for 300 years. In 1945, the land he lost stood victorious over the ruins of Berlin, a superpower reaching for the stars. In 1991, that same superpower dissolved in silence, without a war, without a shot. And in 2026, this very summer, the same ground burns again, in a war that has already dragged on for more than 4 years and cost well over 1 million lives. 4 worlds on one piece of earth in a single century. Each of them was certain of its permanence. The Romanov dynasty believed its crown came from God. The Soviet Union believed it had built a new world that would outlast every empire before it. And the Russia of today believes it can reclaim, by force, the greatness it lost. Each was convinced the ground beneath it was solid. And one after another, they learned it was not. That is the quiet lesson written across the whole of this history. Empires rise, expand, and grow certain of themselves. Then the same weaknesses return, wearing new faces. The names change, the flags change, the pattern beneath them does not. Power is never as solid as it appears. Control is always temporary. The mightiest structures rest on foundations that time, patiently and without mercy, will always wear away. More than 100 years after the crown first fell, the struggle over that same land continues, and its ending has not yet been written. The empire is gone. The revolution is gone. The superpower is gone. And the war that burns there now will one day be gone as well. The land remains, the people remain, and the wheel, as it always has, keeps turning.